And just on the line now, or crossing to Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our colleague in New York, looking at that video showing how President Trump is saying relax, and the unease doesn't seem to be dispelled by looking at the people in the background. And I'd imagine that's also what you're seeing on the streets. It's a ghost town. People told no cinemas, no gyms, and no casinos.
And remember, this is New York City, Tippy. So let me just step out of the way here just for a minute. Look behind me. This is a thoroughfare that connects Grand Central Station with the United Nations in New York. This is the corner of 2nd Avenue and 42nd Street. Generally a thoroughfare filled with people, pedestrians essentially walking to and fro. And we have set up our live shot in the middle of the pavement. So essentially we would be blocking this thoroughfare. But as you can see behind me, there are no people on the streets, hardly any people on the streets, heeding the call from the mayor. Let me read you what Bill de Blasio said overnight in his statement. This is not a decision I make lightly. These places are part of the heart and soul of the city. They are part of what it means to be a New Yorker, referring to the various restaurants and bars and movie theaters and Broadway theaters that are now shuttered. Of course, also making the decision, to close the largest school system in the country, but following similar initiatives in various other states. We had the United Nations weigh in just in terms of the disruption that parents and teachers and pupils are experiencing in terms of schools shutting around the world. Let's listen to what Stefan Duzhrik had to say on this.
UNESCO today said that an unprecedented number of children, youth and adults are not attending schools or university because COVID-19, with 56 countries, have closed school nationwide, impacting more than 516 million children and youth. A further 17 countries have implemented localized school closures, and should these closures become nationwide, hundreds of millions of additional learners will experience education disruption. UNESCO is providing immediate support to countries as they work to minimize the educational disruption and facilitation of continuity of learning, especially for the most vulnerable.
And here's the kicker, Tsipi. So you might hear from various administrations, certainly President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, kind of wanting to set a deadline for the disruptions we are seeing in schooling. We basically don't know when the school system will get back on track, whether you're talking about in the United States or whether you're talking about South Africa. What is pertinent right now, what is prescient right now, is the need for testing, so that countries, governments, administrations have a better understanding in terms of the spread of coronavirus, and that is what the United States is seeking to do by upscaling its testing around the country right now.
And so we note that there's been about 7 deaths in New York State, and not only the deaths, but an increasing number of people who are testing positive for corona. But they've also implemented drive-through tests. How is that working? Any idea on how successful it is in trying to at least curb the spread of the virus?
That really is the ambition, is to have these drive-through tests that we've seen efficiently work in places like Japan and South Korea. That's the goal. We are not there yet. We heard Mitt Romney, the Republican senator from Utah, walk out of a briefing on Capitol Hill earlier today saying he is not happy with the level of testing that is happening in the country. And the reason you are seeing the spike in the number of cases, yesterday the number was 3,000 nationally. Today the number is 3,600 nationally. So you've seen a jump of over 500. Why? Because there's more state capacity to conduct these tests. Historically in the United States, when this virus emerged, tests had to be sent to the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, and of course there was a lag time in getting results out. What you are now seeing is a capacity for states to do their own testing. This is what local authorities here in New York have been calling for. And in addition to that, what New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has been asking the federal government to do is to deploy the Army Corps of Engineers, essentially a unit in the United States military that can set up temporary hospitals, 500-bed hospitals, because the big concern is once testing gets up to speed, you're going to have more cases, more hospitalizations, but the current healthcare system in the United States does not have a sufficient number of beds for for worst case scenarios here. So a lot of moving parts in the story, as you can well imagine, Sipiso.
And I'm just out of curiosity, what about you and other journalists? How is this impacting you? Because you obviously can't stay away, as you mentioned earlier, on the density reducing and busy thoroughways like where you are. But how is this impacting on you and the lives of other journalists? At one point, you have to keep yourself free, but you also have to be at the forefront, at the coalface of the story.
I mean, it's a great question, right? We are taking the precautions we can in terms of what the science is telling us in terms of social distancing. And if you're using public transport, don't get into a packed subway car, because that kind of confinement is where this virus will breed. A lot of people are working from home, certainly text journalists, people that can do interviews over the phone. The UN press corps is not at the United Nations today. That's where we are based. My cameraman and I are trying our best to do this in a responsible fashion, but he also has to understand that if he's going to be out all day and go home to his small baby and his wife, he might then be contagious without even showing symptoms. So these are the issues that journalists also have to be considerate about. We talk about these human interest stories, but what are we doing by placing ourselves in people's homes and in their workplaces, trying to speak to restaurant owners that have shut down, employees that have been laid off? There is a balance between what we can do in terms of getting the story out and also heeding the science in terms of the precautions, because we are human beings as well. And thank you, Tsapisa, for asking. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot for that. And your service, of course, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our correspondent out in New York. And I think on behalf of all other journalists who are, as I mentioned, first responders on these stories, really trying our very best to bring you the latest, the most accurate. They are putting themselves on the line, as you are, Aldrin.